Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to our weekly Chai Chat program brought to you by the American Center Tashkent. My name is Gulshan, and I'm very excited to introduce our special guest, Alan Meltzer. Mr. Meltzer is a career officer of the Senior Foreign Service and serves as a Deputy Chief of Mission in the U.S. Embassy in Tashkent since 2018. He previously served as a Deputy Chief of Mission and Chargé d'Affaires at the U.S. Embassy in Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan. His career has been divided between Eurasia and Latin America. He served in Georgia, Russia, Mexico, and other Latin American countries. A native of New York State, Mr. Meltzer received a Juris Doctor degree from the University of Virginia School of Law and Bachelor of Arts degree with honors from Harvard College. In 2016, he was a distinguished graduate of the National Defense University's College of International Security Affairs. He speaks Spanish and Russian. He is married and he has a daughter. And in his free time, he enjoys biking, skiing, hiking, reading, wine, and travel. Thank you so much, Mr. Meltzer, for taking your time to do this presentation for us.
Thank you very much, Gulshan. It's a pleasure to do it. And good evening, everyone. So I thought with our presidential election just a few days away, it would be useful to spend a chai chat explaining the presidential election process to you. Our election process for the presidency is especially complicated. I think there are even some people in the US that don't fully understand it. And so my goal tonight is to explain the process to you so that when you are watching the news Tuesday or Wednesday, in the newspaper, reading on the internet, you'll understand exactly what's happening. One thing I will not do, though, is to talk about politics. It's a very sensitive topic. As a career diplomat, we are apolitical, just like career military officers. We work for whomever the American people elect and work from one president to the next one. And so it's part of our tradition not to get involved in politics. And so I will focus on the process. I will talk for probably about 20 minutes, and then I'm happy to take whatever questions you might have. Let's go to the first slide, please. And then the next one. One more, yeah. So the first thing you need to understand the American presidential election process is to remember that the US is a federal republic. It wasn't just citizens coming together to form a country, but rather 13 states originally, and of course now 50, and the states acted as units representing their citizens. So the emphasis on federalism is stronger in the US than in some other countries. And for that reason, the system we use to elect the president has a focus on states, in a sense, and we'll be talking a little bit about that. But so keep in mind that it's based on the fact that we are a federal republic. The presidential election day is always, and this is complicated, the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. Why November? Because by November, when they first passed this law, it was thought that all the harvests were in. And so farmers could take the time to go to town and vote. And Tuesday made sense because, well, Wednesday was a market day and people needed to work. Sunday was, of course, a day for church. And so Tuesday was a good, convenient day in between. And so that's why the election is always the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. Next slide, please. All of you, I'm sure, know that the US has what is essentially a two-party system, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. Our founding fathers did not design a party system, though they understood that it might evolve. And the law doesn't create a party system. The party system evolved early on, and then the system developed essentially to accommodate the fact that there are two major parties. And those are really the major players in the presidential election process. But as we'll talk about, there are more than two parties. Next slide, please. So right now, the White House is, of course, held by the Republicans, by President Donald Trump and Vice President Michael Pence. According to polls, the Republicans represent about 25% of the population right now, or maybe it's better to say 25% of Americans affiliate or feel they feel affiliated with the Republican Party. But that changes with time. And it varies quite a bit from over periods of years. The other major party, of course, is the Democratic Party. Right now, polls show that about 31% of Americans consider themselves Democrats. So 25 and 31, that's only 56% of Americans. And in fact, 40% of Americans, according to polls, consider themselves independent, not belonging to, not affiliating with either major political party. That number has been growing with time. 20, 30 years ago, the number of Republicans and Democrats were both larger, and the number of independents was lower. But over time, the number of Americans who consider themselves independent has been steadily increasing. Next slide, please. So we've talked about the two major political parties, but in fact, there are more than two parties. Next slide, Gulshan, to slide number 6. As we'll see a little later when I show you a sample ballot from one state, in some states, multiple parties besides the Republicans and Democrats compete for the president. Probably the two biggest national parties, aside from the major parties, are the Libertarian Party and the Green Party. The Libertarian Party tends to believe in a very small government, low taxes, and maximum individual freedoms. And the Green Party puts a lot of emphasis on environmentalism and ecology. So those are probably the two biggest. The other smaller parties tend to be considerably smaller. In some states, there are many of them, though, as we'll see in one example. Next slide, please. Some people complain that our presidential election process is too long because it really starts a year and a half before the election. The first stage of the process is called the primaries, and that's where the two major parties have internal processes to decide who their candidate will be. Some years in the past, you might have had only 2 or 3 or 4 Democrats or Republicans participating in the primaries, but in other years you could have 10 or 15. In 2016, where this photograph is taken from, there were, I don't remember precisely, but approximately 15 Republicans. And this shows a debate from the 2016 Republican primary process. And there you see in the middle, now President Trump raising his hand to speak. So the primary process is run by each party. It's not run by the Board of Elections, but rather by each party. The rules vary from one state to another, and it is a process to determine who will represent the party in what we call the general election. It can be very competitive. Sometimes one candidate is dominant from the beginning. Sometimes there are many candidates, but it quickly gets down to only 2 major candidates, and then they are very competitive. And sometimes the process is a little bit more complicated. When there is an incumbent president, and now we have an incumbent Republican president, there usually is not a major primary process in that party. So in the Republican Party this year, there were a couple of candidates who were not very widely supported, who competed against President Trump, but it was always considered that they had very little chance. And President Trump easily defeated them very, very quickly for the Republican nomination. In the case of the Democratic Party, it was considered an open primary. There was no Democratic president running for re-election. And a situation like that attracts many ambitious politicians. And so we had many Democratic candidates competing this year, as you might remember. And in the first, and the lead, in this whole process of debates and so forth, polls show the lead going back and forth between many different Democratic candidates. And it was only after several primaries were concluded that former Vice President Biden then emerged as the dominant Democratic candidate and eventually secured the Democratic nomination. So after the primary process concludes, and in a very competitive year, it could go as late as June, that candidates in one party are still competing with each other. After that, in the summertime, the two major parties each hold conventions where they bring together delegates from all the states around the country. They present their candidate for president, for vice president, usually major leaders from other parties, from that party. For example, if they had former presidents, the former president might speak. They might give a speaking role to other candidates who competed in the primaries, and they might even choose someone, a young but up-and-coming person, a rising star, to give what they call the keynote speech. The conventions are kind of like large political festivals. This year, of course, due to COVID, neither party held a regular convention. They did things online and in smaller groups. But normally the conventions are an important part of the process. And so that leads to the general election campaign. As I said, election day is in November, and so the general election campaign typically runs from the beginning of September until election day in November. It has become our tradition over the last 45 years or so to have debates between the presidential and vice presidential candidates from the two major parties. Traditionally, there are three debates between the two presidential candidates and one between the two vice presidential candidates. Nothing in law about that. It's simply the tradition that has developed over the last 45 years, and the parties have generally held to that. The debates are organized by what's called a commission on presidential debates that includes equal representatives from the two major parties. And they negotiate with the campaigns of the two parties to create a debate that, under conditions that the two candidates consider fair and equal. This shows a debate this year, October, between President Trump and former Vice President Biden. Due to COVID this year, there were only two presidential debates and one vice presidential debate. Some Americans complain that the debates are too scripted, too rehearsed, that the candidates tend to have talking points that they use rather than speak entirely off the cuff. I don't agree with that. Most of the campaign, in fact, is very tightly controlled. Candidates have certain speeches that they'll give over and over again. certain points that they'll make to particular audiences, and there's not a lot of room to see, or not a lot of opportunity to see the two candidates next to each other answering the same or similar questions and being able to compare them side by side. So I do think that the debates serve a very useful role in that way, so that voters can compare the two candidates in real time and how they answer the same questions. Next slide, please. So what makes the American presidential election system so complicated is what is called the Electoral College. You've probably heard about it, but this is what you really need to understand to fully understand the elections. The Electoral College is a group of 538 representatives from around the country. In order to win the presidency, you need to win a majority of 538. So a majority is 270. A tie would be 269, so 270 represents the majority. Why are there 538 electoral votes? That number represents the total number of members of Congress, 435 members in the House of Representatives, 100 senators, so that's 535, plus 3 electors for the District of Columbia, the nation's capital, which is not part of any state. So those numbers, as you see on the map, are allocated to states based on the population of each state. You'll see on the West Coast, California, with 55 electoral votes, is by far the largest state. Some states, like Wyoming and Montana, the Dakotas and Vermont, are very small and have only 3 electoral votes, which is the minimum. And what is important to understand, and we'll get to this a little more, is that when Americans go to vote, they're voting indirectly for the presidential candidate of their choice. They are actually, and can we skip ahead to slide 11, Gulshan? Yeah. I don't know if you can read the small print, but that is a sample ballot from a town in upstate New York. And you see on the left column, it lists the parties: Democratic, Republican, Conservative, Working Party, Green, Libertarian, and then some more. And if you look above the second column, it says presidential electors for president and vice president. So when you vote, whether for Donald Trump and Mike Pence or Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, you are voting for electors who are members of the Electoral College who have promised to support that candidate when the Electoral College meets. So again, you're not voting in theory directly for the candidate, but rather for their representative on the Electoral College. I'll just point out here that in New York State, the 2 major party candidates each also have the endorsement of minor parties. So Donald Trump has the endorsement of the Conservative Party, and Joe Biden has the endorsement of the Working Families Party. Those parties only exist in New York, as far as I know, and it's just a New York thing. You could vote for either major candidate, either on their Democratic Republican line or Conservative Working Family line, and those votes will be added into their overall total. And you can see here that New Yorkers in this town this year are voting for state Supreme Court judges, representative of Congress, state legislature, and county clerk. And at the bottom it says write-in. So in addition to voting for any of the candidates on the ballot, you are free to write in any person of your choice. And to vote, you just fill in the little oval at the top next to that candidate. and that filling in of the oval is read by a machine reader. So you're probably wondering, and we can go ahead to the next slide, why did the early Americans come up with such a complicated system to elect their president? Why didn't they just use a direct popular vote where you count the total number of votes by people for each candidate, and the one with the most votes wins? It's a very good question, and it's something that people have debated for 2 centuries now and continue to debate. In fact, no one thought, when the founding fathers created the Electoral College, they did not think, we have created the ideal system for electing the president. Rather, it was a compromise needed to secure representatives from all 13 colonies, all 13 states. At that time, there were some representatives who thought the president should be directly elected by the people. Whoever gets the most individual votes wins. There were other people who didn't like that system, who were afraid of the idea of a direct election. You have to remember, in the 18th century, the idea of directly electing a president or ruler had never been tried, at least not since the days of ancient Greece, on a very small scale. Rulers were hereditary, kings and queens and czars. And people were afraid, some people, that that the public could be easily swayed by demagogues, by by candidates who maybe were not trustworthy or that stirred the passions of the people, and they wanted there to be a check on popular sentiment. So they thought that by creating this system of the Electoral College, where you have a carefully selected group of people actually choosing the president, that it provided this kind of check. Our founding fathers were in particular very concerned about having an executive that was too powerful. They had just won a revolution against an absolutist British monarch, and they didn't want to create a monarch of their own in the United States. In fact, in the beginning, they preferred a much weaker central government under a system called the Articles of Confederation. And it was only under our Constitution in 1789 that this system was created, because the first system was just too weak. So the founding fathers, under this compromise, created the Electoral College, where voters in each state elect representatives of the candidates, and those people then meet and elect the candidate. There's a second level of compromise reflected in the creation of the Electoral College, though, and this too is historically very important. At the time of the creation of the United States, the northern and southern states were roughly equal in population. They were pretty close in population. However, over 1/3 of the people living in the southern states were slaves, and they were not permitted to vote. And so their population would not count towards the number of congressional representatives those states would have, or the number of electors which they had in the Electoral College. In other words, the southern states would have less influence in the national government than the northern states. To create a system in which the South had more equal influence to the North, they reached what was called the 3/5 compromise, in which slaves were counted as the number of slaves. 3/5 of the number of slaves was included in the counting of population for purposes of determining congressional representation and members of the Electoral College for the states. Obviously, all of that relates to a dark chapter of American history, but that was one of the reasons why some people also preferred this system. I should say also, until 1824, after we had already had 6 or 7 presidential elections, most state legislatures chose their state electors themselves. The people didn't vote for George Washington or John Adams. The state legislatures did. It's really only in 1824 when the majority of people around the US were able to vote directly for the president of their choosing. So we have that complicated system, and one more element of that is that in all the states but 2, it's a winner-take-all system. So if you win California, if a candidate wins California, they win all 55 electoral votes from California. Even if they only win California by 1%, if it's very, very close, they win all 55 electoral votes. And that creates some very unusual incentives in the campaign. And let's go to the next page, please. If you're following our campaign, you would have seen that the 2 major candidates are focusing on what are called swing states, states that are very close and large enough to affect the outcome. So you look at California. This map, which is up here now, shows from the 2004 election how many visits by the presidential candidates in the last 5 weeks. So California, the biggest state, only had 2 visits, and it's the biggest state. Why? Only 2 visits? Because California, in recent history, has always voted for the Democratic candidate. So there's no point in either Democrats or Republicans campaigning there. In fact, the 2 visits were probably just for fundraising, less than to campaign, because everyone knows the Democrats will win California. The second largest state by population is Texas. Nobody visited Texas in the last 5 weeks of that campaign. Why? Because until recently, at least, Texas was considered very solidly Republican. It always voted for the Republican presidential candidate since, I think, 1976. And there was no point for either party to visit because campaigning wouldn't change that. So you look at the map and you could see that most of the attention from the campaigns was on big states that were very close. Florida is the biggest, but also Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, and to a lesser degree, Iowa. Those are the swing states, states that typically were very close enough where a lot of effort by one side or the other would swing it to one party or the other. And so what this means is that during the intense period of the campaign, all the effort, or nearly all the effort, is just focused on these swing states. You look, a number of states have no visits, and others have many, many visits. And so that incentive is created by the Electoral College system. If you lived in New York now or in California, you would see few or no advertisements for the presidential candidates on television, because there's no point in either campaign spending money to advertise in a state that always goes Democratic. And similarly, you wouldn't find advertisements in a state like Utah that always goes Republican. But if you live in Ohio or Florida, you are probably seeing advertisements by both campaigns hour after hour after hour. So let's go back, let's go forward to slide 14, please, the next slide. This shows the electoral map from 2016 when President Trump defeated Hillary Clinton. Blue states are states that the Democratic candidate won, and red states are the states that that President Trump won. And you can just see by geography, the Democrats tended to win the Northeast, the West Coast, a couple of states in the Rocky Mountains, New Mexico and Colorado, and a couple of states in the northern Midwest. The southern states and the Rocky Mountain states and the prairie states almost always voted Republican. And that was the pattern here. Now, this election represented a phenomenon that's only happened about 4 times in American history. In this case, Hillary Clinton actually won more popular votes than President Trump. She won 48.2%, and he won 46.1%. But he won more electoral votes, and as a result, he won the presidency. So what happens is, in a case like this, Hillary Clinton won a big state like California by millions of votes more than the Republican candidate, but he won important states like Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania by smaller margins, but because of the winner-take-all system, he gets all their electoral votes. And that is the unusual twist of our electoral system. Let's go back, let's go forward, and we'll look at 2012, when then President Obama defeated Mitt Romney for re-election. Here, President Trump had won 51% of the vote, and Mitt Romney 47%. The Electoral College, in some cases, can exaggerate a president's margin. So the President Obama had 332 electoral votes, and Mitt Romney only 206. That's a pretty big margin, even though the popular vote margin was 4%. And you'll see the major difference with 2016 is that President Obama won Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, and Ohio. Those 4 states are called the Blue Wall. Historically, Democrats have counted on winning those states to win the election. If they won those states, then they usually had enough other states to win. If they lost most of those states, as Hillary Clinton did in 2016, then the blue wall crumbled, as we saw, and the Republican candidate would win. And so that shows why the 2 candidates now are focusing on these big swing states. Over the next 4 days until Tuesday, they'll probably visit Ohio and Florida, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin multiple times. Let's go forward one more slide. This shows the state of Virginia, and I wanted to show you one state to give you an example. Here you can see the Republican candidate. This was President Trump, represented by red, won the overwhelming part of the state. Those are rural areas, farm areas, and the Republican candidate normally has great strength there. The blue areas tended to be cities or densely populated suburbs. For example, this is the suburb of Washington, D.C. up here, and also areas where there are large African-American populations. And those areas historically tended to vote Democratic. So in this particular case, actually Hillary Clinton won this state because she won the areas where the concentration was focused, where the population is focused, where the greatest population centers are. The Washington suburbs, the capital Richmond, and the area around Norfolk. Let's move forward one more slide. This was the 2000 election when George Bush defeated Al Gore. This was the most controversial election, at least in modern American history, because it was so close. Al Gore won 48.4%, George Bush 47.9%. Only 0.5% difference, but George Bush had more electoral votes because he won the state of Florida. You see the blue wall here was broken. Al Gore did not win Ohio. If he had won Ohio, he would have won the presidency. Without Ohio, he had to win Florida. And what made this so controversial is that in Florida, 6 million people voted, but the margin between them was only 537 votes, I believe. So out of 6 million people, you had a margin of 537 votes. That was an incredibly narrow margin. And for more complicated reasons, it had to be decided by the Supreme Court. Next slide, please. This shows you a real landslide in 1984, where Ronald Reagan won 49 states, and the Democratic candidate, Walter Mondale, only won his home state of Minnesota and Washington, D.C., which is too small to be seen in blue. Here, and again, it's an example of the Electoral College exaggerating, you might say, the mandate. There was a 19-point difference, 18-point difference between the candidates, which is huge in American terms. But when you look at the electoral vote, it's 525 to 13, which is even far huger. Let's go forward one more. This shows the 1960 election, when John Kennedy very narrowly defeated Richard Nixon. And I'm showing this slide only to show you that the way in which states have vote has changed over time. In 1960, the entire West Coast was solidly Republican. Now it's solidly Democratic. Northern New England was solidly Republican, and now it's generally Democratic. The South was solidly Democratic for historical reasons, which we could talk about in question and answer, and now it's mostly, almost entirely Republican. So you can see that for internal political dynamics, the way states vote changes over time. Next slide. This shows the second election in U.S. history, 1792, when George Washington was elected. He ran essentially unopposed. He won all 132 electoral votes, and although most people did not use popular votes back then, in some states you were able to cast a popular vote, even though only the electoral vote counted. But he won virtually 100%. So that was the only time that occurred in American history. Next slide, please. What happens if there's a tie in the Electoral College? You have 538 electors. What if each candidate wins 269 electoral votes? It gets very complicated, and if that were to happen, you would see some very intense politics. But what would happen in that case is the House of Representatives would decide. Each state delegation, there are 50 states, each state delegation would vote amongst themselves which candidate to support, and then each of those 50 states would vote for one or the other, and whichever candidate won more states would win. Anyway, that is my presentation, but I'm happy to take any questions you might have about the process. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Meltzer. It was very interesting and very informative. We have several questions here. Let's see what they are. So the question from the U.S. Embassy Tashkent. DCM Meltzer, do you know why the symbols for the two major parties are the donkey and elephant?
That's a really good question, and I don't know the answer, actually. I'm sure you could find it on the internet, but unfortunately, I don't know the answer. Both symbols date back to the 19th century, so they are historic symbols.
Mm-hmm. And I would like to chime in, if I may. We just posted information, a video about this. So whoever is interested, they can go back to American Center Tashkent page and watch the video where everything is explained. Let's look at the next question from the U.S. Embassy Tashkent. You said that the reason the U.S. has the Electoral College is rooted in history, that it reflected the times in the 18th century. Is there any discussion about changing the system to reflect 21st century tendencies? who would even have the power or authority to change the system?
A very good question. Actually, there's constant discussion in the United States about changing the system, constant debate about that. And that debate became more intense after the 2000 election, when one candidate who had, the candidate who had the most popular vote didn't win. And then again, it happened in 2016. Again, that debate was triggered again. The issue is that in order to change the system, you generally would need a constitutional amendment. And our founders preferred stability to change. And they made it, frankly, very difficult to change the constitutional amendment, to change the Constitution by amendment. The most common way of doing it is to get a vote of 2/3 in each House of Congress for an amendment, and then that has to be approved by 3/4 of the states. For that reason, the US Constitution has been amended very few times in its history. And because the Electoral College is seen as favoring small states, they would have no incentive to support it. So it's unlikely we could get that 3/4 majority of states to support it.
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you. So I have a question. How COVID-19 has changed voting procedures this year in the United States?
A very good question. In recent elections, they started to develop a system of early voting. In the US, unlike in some countries, voting isn't on Sunday or on a holiday. It's a work day. And so it can be hard for some people to go and vote if they have a difficult job. And so procedures were developed in many states for early voting, where you could vote a few weeks before the election. And because of COVID, those procedures were expanded, as well as what's called absentee voting. So it's become much easier for people to vote before the election when they don't have to wait in line and be in a big crowd. And actually, already, even though the election is still 4 days away, about 80 million people have already voted. And that maybe is 3/4, I'm guessing, perhaps 70%, 3/4 of the number of people who voted overall in 2016. So what that shows is by making it easier to vote, by having this early voting and mail-in voting, many more people do vote.
Mm-hmm. That's a big difference.
Yeah.
So Dilnoza Mirazimova is asking, what does the popular vote term mean? What is popular vote?
When we say popular vote, we mean the actual votes cast by people. So let's say that Barack Obama won, let's see, well, I forget how many, but let's say he won 55 million votes and Mitt Romney 50 million votes. Those are popular votes, 55 million versus 50 million, whereas the electoral votes are from the system that we mentioned. And the key point is that you can get more popular votes than the other candidate and still lose in the Electoral College and lose the election.
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you. Is it possible that the electoral votes awarded on the basis of state elections could produce a different result than a nationwide popular vote? And have it ever happened in the history of the US?
I'm not sure if I understood that question.
So if a person wins in one state and then the majority, he didn't receive a majority in the vote when it's on the state level. All right, let's see what the person who asked the question will probably clarify the question.
Okay, but let's go back. There's another point to make. Let's go back to slide number 14.
Mm-hmm. One sec. All right.
Back one more, I think. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So if you look here, there were two major candidates, but other people got electoral votes. And this raises another point. Are electors required to vote for the person they promised to vote for? So if you vote in South Dakota and you voted for the electors for Donald Trump, do those electors have to vote for him? Or can they vote for someone else? And it depends on state law. And you can see here in the state of Washington, for example, Hillary Clinton won, but 4 of her electors voted for other people. 3 voted for Colin Powell, the former Secretary of State and general, and 1 voted for a Native American leader, Spotted Eagle. There's a question as to whether the electors are required to vote for the candidate they promised to. And I'm not sure that's settled in law. In this case, 4 electors did not vote. In some states, they would be punished. They'd pay a fine, but nevertheless, they'd cast their votes differently. In this election, it wasn't close enough to affect the outcome. Donald Trump already had 304 electoral votes, so it didn't matter. But what if it were 269, and one of those people voted for someone else? That would change the outcome, and it would create a huge political and legal crisis.
Mm-hmm. All right, that makes sense. Thank you. Our next question is from Dania Hasanova. How does voting work for Americans who live abroad?
Okay, Americans are entitled to vote regardless of where they live. You apply for what's called an absentee ballot in the state where you are registered, and they will mail it to you or perhaps email it to you, and you vote and sign it and put it in the mail and send it back. So it's done by mail. Sometimes they'll email you the ballot, but then you have to return it by regular mail.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And talking about voting, who is eligible to vote at the presidential elections of the U.S.?
Well, in the U.S., any U.S. citizen who is 18 years old can vote in any election. So you have to be 18 years old to vote.
Mm-hmm. Right, thank you. We have a question from Jamshedbek Ibrahimov. He's asking, what is the major difference between the 2 candidates and parties? Thank you in advance.
That's a very good question, and you could write a book or 2 or many about it. I won't go into too much detail. What I will say is the Republican Party tends to be perceived as conservative and the Democratic Party as liberal. So the Republicans more to the right, the Democrats more to the left, with all that implies about economic policy, markets, defense, and so forth. Historically, the parties represented a much broader, each party represented a broader spectrum of opinion, and there was some overlap. There were conservative Democrats and liberal Republicans, but over time, that has changed. And so the Democratic Party tends to be from the center all the way to the left, and the Republican Party from the center all the way to the right. So it tends to be those 2 wings of political opinion.
All right, thank you. I just want to remind everyone, if you have questions about electoral process in the United States, please feel free to put your questions in the comments right here, and we'll make sure Ellen Meltzer will answer this question. All right, let me see. I don't see any other questions so far. All right, question about inauguration. How much time does it take for the president? How much time is between the winning the elections and having inauguration day? And how does it happen? What happens during the inauguration day?
That's an important question that gets at something I didn't discuss. So the election is November 3rd. In mid-December, the Electoral College meets. I believe what happens is the members meet in each state capital around the country and cast their votes. And so if for example, if Joe Biden wins California, the 55 electors will go to the state capitol in Sacramento and cast their 55 votes for Joe Biden. And that happens in every state capital. And then every state capital sends that result to the national capital. And so that process happens in the states in mid-December. On January 6th in the Congress opens those 51 letters that they got from each capital and reads the results and adds it up and sees that, yes, candidate A or candidate B got a majority of electoral votes. Or if not, that there's an equal number and they have to break the tie. So that's the process, the electoral process until the election, until the inauguration day. And the inauguration is always on January 20th. So that's one phase of the process. Now, usually there's a result known the day after the election or pretty soon after the election. And the winner then has a little over 2 months to form his government, to pick his or her cabinet members, chief advisors, sub-cabinet members, to put together policies, and basically get ready so that on January 20th, after the inauguration, they control all the levers of power in the government. So they have to organize themselves and be prepared to take control of the government on January 20th. And whatever happens, the incumbent president's term ends at noon on January 20th. So there will be a new president, regardless, and either if the incumbent is reelected or if there's a new person elected, a new term starts at noon on January 20th.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. U.S. Embassy Tashkent is asking, which presidents have you met in person?
Well, I haven't had an extended conversation with any. I met George Bush Sr. and George Bush Jr. Sr. when he was already retired. I met him in Moscow, actually. And George Bush Jr. I met in Mexico. And I shook hands with Bill Clinton in Guatemala, but we didn't talk. I think that's it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, presidents have a big circle of people around them, and not many people have the chance, or not a very large percentage of the country actually meets the president. If you work in an embassy and they come visit the country, typically the president will meet with the embassy community. So if you're working in Mexico City and the president goes to visit, he'll usually have a short meeting with the embassy community. And that's how I met George Bush and how I met his father in Moscow.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So the question, if a ballot is tossed because of some issue, maybe a missing signature or it got damaged, will the voter be notified that the ballot's been invalidated, and can the voter cast a new ballot?
Another very good question. The thing about our electoral system is that each state makes its own rules as to how the election is done there. And in fact, within the state, each county might use a different technology. So in one county, you might use a sheet like this, where you fill in the oval. In another county, you might use an old-fashioned machine where you pull a lever. In another one, a punch card, where you have to punch the hole for your candidate. And most of those technologies are imperfect. And often there are many ballots where it's not clear how the person wanted to vote. What if they filled in the oval for Joe Biden, but then crossed it out and filled in Donald Trump? Who is that a vote for? If they X'd out Joe Biden and then filled Donald Trump, is that a vote for Donald Trump? There would be a debate, and a vote like that might not be counted. So That is a big problem when there's a very narrow margin. In some states, what they try to do when you mail in a vote is they compare your signature to the one that's on record to make sure it looks the same. And if it's not the same, in some states, they'll call you and give you the opportunity to come in and swear to the vote or not. In other states, they may not be able to do that. In the case of the 2000 election, when George Bush won Florida by 537 votes, there were many thousands of votes that were disqualified because it wasn't clear how the person voted. Maybe they put 2 X's, or maybe they didn't put any, or maybe they put a mark on the side. For whatever reason, it wasn't clear how they voted, and thousands of votes, far more than the margin, had to be disqualified. And that was that made it a very tense process.
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you. What are the rules around poll watching on election day in the United States?
I don't actually know. I believe that each party is allowed to have a watcher there. In most states, you are not allowed to campaign within a certain number of meters from the place. Like maybe you can't have signs within 100 meters of the voting place. But I don't know what the rules are about voter observation. And it probably varies from state to state.
All right. So I don't see any new questions, and we are running out of time. And I want to thank you, Mr. Meltzer, for your interesting presentation. And it was very informative, so many things that we've heard from you about US elections. I want to thank all our viewers who asked interesting questions too. And yeah, thank you so much. That was a great presentation.
Thank you for your help, Gulshan. And thank you, everyone. It was a pleasure to speak with you.
Mm-hmm. All right. And I want to remind you that we're meeting next Friday at the same time with our next speaker. Please make sure to join us. All right. See you and have a good weekend. Bye.
Bye.